Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Norwich Science Festival online event. My name is Catherine Downs, and I work in the Public Engagement and Events team at the University of East Anglia. Thank you for joining us today for this live stream, and please do let us know if in the chat where you are watching from. Before our event begins, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for today. John Spencer is a Professor of Psychology at the University of East Anglia. Prior to arriving in the UK, he was a professor at the University of Iowa and served as the founding director of the Delta Center. He is a recipient of the 2003 Early Research Contributions Award from the Society for Research in Child Development and the 2006 Robert L. Fantz Memorial Award from the American Psychological Foundation. His research focuses on the development of executive function, including working memory, attention, and inhibitory control. He is also a pioneer in the use of dynamical systems and dynamic neural field models for understanding cognition and action. Without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Professor Spencer to give his lecture on the impact of poverty on the developing brain. Welcome to Professor Spencer.
Thank you very much. Today I'll be presenting work from my group in the Developmental Dynamics Laboratory at UEA. This work was done in collaboration with folks at the Community Empowerment Lab in Lucknow, India. Let's see here. There we go. So each year, approximately 200 million children fail to reach their developmental potential. India accounts for more than a quarter of this global burden. Striking progress has been made in reducing infant mortality in India. However, moving children from surviving to thriving is a huge challenge. But the impact of poverty is not isolated to lower income countries. For example, the impact of poverty is felt here in the UK as well. A 2013 report estimated that child poverty costs the UK at least 29 billion each year. Of this, approximately 20 billion is a direct cost to government, resulting from additional demand on services and benefits, as well as reduced tax receipts. This demand is felt most strongly on education and health systems. For example, children from poorer backgrounds lag at all stages of education. By age 3, poorer children are on average 9 months behind. By the end of primary school, children receiving free meals are almost 3 terms behind. Poverty also has an impact on the health system. Poverty is associated with a higher risk of infant mortality, and children experiencing poverty have a higher risk of chronic illness and disability. But how does poverty have its impact early in development? One key factor may be the impact of poverty on the developing brain. Showing you a key result from a 2015 report in Nature Neuroscience, showing that as parental education, shown here on the x-axis, goes up, the total surface area of the brain goes up as well. So you can see this linear relationship shown by the black line. Why is surface area in the brain important? It indicates more efficient connections in the brain and more efficient signaling among cells. The bottom panel here shows that the effect is felt most strongly in the frontal cortex, as well as parts of the back of the brain here in parietal cortex and the temporal-parietal junction, which I'll talk about later in my talk. So what you can see here is that poverty is having an impact on the brain. Crucially, these brain effects might be most dramatic early in development. The reason is that there's massive brain growth in the first 4 years, followed by refinement and connections. So shown here along the x-axis is a timeline from conception into adulthood. You can see the timeline's a little bit weird because we've stretched out the period from birth to 2 years to highlight how much the brain grows in the first 4 years. The blue line shows the developmental trajectory for visual cortex. You can see there's this big increase in brain growth up to about the end of the first year, and then refinement thereafter as synaptic connections become pruned away. So that's why you see that decrease. That's basically an increase in the efficiency of the brain as you're pruning away connections that you don't need. Similar trajectory for the front of the brain, which is shown in the red line. So as you can see, there's this massive growth in the brain up to about 4 years. And then again, this refinement in the connections in the brain that extends out into adolescence. So there's this massive brain growth early. Now that means that this early period in development might be critical in terms of the impact of poverty. So while this data suggests that poverty may have its biggest impact early in life, I think there's an important positive side that I want to highlight. The positive side comes from studies looking at infants who have a stroke in the first year. You may have heard that language is processed largely on the left side of the brain, and that's true for most people. Interestingly, however, this shows the brain of an infant who had a stroke during birth, and you can see the white part of this brain is pretty massive damage to the left side of the brain. I know it's a little weird to look at this slide and I'm saying left side of the brain, but this is done in what's called radiological coordinates, and so the left side of the brain is on the right side of the image. A bit weird, I know, but bear with me. If you can see my cursor, you can see all this white area. Basically, this child lost most of the left hemisphere in the brain. And you would think if language lives in the left side of the brain, this child would not be able to develop language. Well, it turns out this child by the age of 8 had standard language abilities and was indistinguishable from normal children on many language tests. So what happened with this child is basically the brain reorganized itself. And so in this particular child, language lives in the right hemisphere. And I really like this slide because it's a striking result that this child was able to overcome basically losing most of a hemisphere and develop normal language abilities by age 8. And so even though poverty can have its impact most strongly in the first couple years of life, there's also profound possibilities for overcoming those impacts of poverty in the first couple of years of life. And so that's what I'm going to focus on through the remainder of my talk. So I think this picture conveys a hopeful perspective that even though the brain might be impacted by poverty in the first couple of years of life, if we could develop effective interventions in the first couple of years of life, we might be able to counter these effects. This is consistent with economic analyses by Nobel laureate James Heckman. He showed that early interventions in the first couple of years of life give back the greatest rate of return to society. So his analyses show that investments in early development for disadvantaged children have a 12% return on investment through better outcomes in education, health, sociability, economic productivity, and reduced crime. So basically, the message here is if you want to have an impact on how poverty affects the brain, we want to intervene early. And that's sort of the vision we've been working toward in my lab. Okay, so that's a little bit of background about how we know poverty is impacting the brain. We know that's having an impact on education and health systems. We know there's massive growth in the first couple of years of life. So the message is we want to start early. So really in the remainder of the talk, I'm going to focus on how we might do that. The first thing we're going to need if we want to start early is we need a precise assessment and intervention tools. So first we want to target neurocognitive systems that emerge in infancy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about exemplary system that emerges in infancy that we've been focusing in on, which is the working memory system. These systems not only need to emerge in infancy, but they need to be predictive of long-term outcomes. And I'll tell you a little bit about data suggesting that working memory is a good predictive system. These systems should also be the building blocks of later abilities. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that language abilities in the 3 to 5 year window and executive function abilities in the 3 to 5 year window set the stage for better outcomes. So if we can improve something like working memory, which builds into language, which builds into executive function, we might be able to essentially shape the trajectory of a child to improve long-term outcomes, even out to 30 years of age. Okay, so we want a system that is a building block of those important components like language and executive function. And then we need something that's sensitive, right? If we're going to have an assessment tool, for example, we want to know that it's detecting the influence of things like the impact of poverty, detecting things like the impact of education of the parents, the income of the family, and other contextual factors that have been shown to be important. So our sort of candidate system for early assessment and intervention that we've been focusing on is something called visual working memory. So what is visual working memory? This is a cognitive system that holds visual information in mind for just a few seconds. And we use the system about 10,000 times each day to remember what we're looking at and compare what we're looking at to what we saw before to detect changes in the world when they occur. I'll make this concrete by showing you just a simple example. So imagine I'm sitting there at my computer doing some work, and I turn to the cooler, and then I turn back and look at my workstation. There was a subtle change I made in between slides 1 and 2 as the visual world shifted. I'll go back to the first slide again, and then look to the cooler and the second slide. Hopefully some of you have detected that the white cup sitting here on the left, my coffee cup, has changed. So it was a black coffee cup, and it changed to a white coffee cup. I'll do one more change. Actually, first let me explain what happened there. So my colleague sitting next to me picked up the wrong coffee cup. So that explains why the world changed in that condition. Hopefully that was relatively easy for you folks to spot because we went from a black mug to a white mug. I can also do something more subtle and change from a black mug of coffee to a black mug of tea. So here you have to remember a subtle detail, that the presence versus absence of that little tea bag tag there. So one of the things that makes visual working memory interesting is that it's very limited. So we can only hold, about 3 to 5 items in working memory. So that means when I look out into the complex world around me, I'm really only remembering about 3 items or 3 details about the world. And so you can imagine if I'm sitting there at my workstation, if I don't detect the details about the coffee cup as one of the 3 things I remember, I might miss the change that occurs in the world. If we look at how visual working memory changes over development, we see that there's a dramatic change in visual working memory from infancy into adulthood. Along the x-axis here, I'm showing age. So we've got infants down here, and then 3, 4, 5-year-olds up into adulthood here. And what I'm plotting is data from a variety of studies that have looked at the capacity of working memory and how it changes across the first year of life. And what you can see is kind of a nice gradual change from a capacity of about 1 item in infancy up to a capacity of about 4 to 5 items in adulthood. And so over the course of a child's life, there's a systematic and gradual improvement in working memory and how many details they can capture about the world around them. Now, visual working memory is a great target for early assessment and intervention for a couple of reasons. First of all, we can measure individual differences in infancy. So, individual differences in whether an infant remembers 1 item or maybe 1.5 items or 2 items in infancy is predictive of outcomes 11 years later. So infants who have stronger working memory early in that first year have better schooling outcomes by age 11. Similarly, infants who have poorer working memory abilities in infancy have poorer schooling outcomes at age 11. We also know from recent work that interventions designed to enhance visual working memory have shown promise with at-risk children. For example, preterm infants tend to show deficits in visual working memory in the first year of life. And interventions targeting ways to boost visual working memory for at-risk preterm infants have shown that they are effective and that those effects carry forward into the first couple years of life, improving their cognitive abilities. The third reason why visual working memory is a great assessment and intervention target is that we can measure visual working memory cross-culturally using the task I'm showing here at the bottom. So in this task, we cue infants' attention to look at the center of the screen, and then we show them displays. On the left, you can see we've got a blue and an orange color, and on the right is a red and green color. We show them those two displays for 500 milliseconds, and then we give them a challenge. We turn the displays off and ask them to remember those displays for 250 milliseconds, a very short delay, but it's challenging for infants. Then the displays come back on, and you can see the display on the left side is always the same. It's always that same blue and orange color, while the display on the right always changes. So the red item changes to purple here, the purple item changes to yellow, and maybe on the next frame, the green item would change into another color altogether. So the logic of this task is that, let's say infants look over to the left, and let's say they can remember the blue and the orange color, so they have a capacity of 2 items. If they can remember those 2 items for that short delay, they should remember, this is that blue and orange thing again. And if they can remember it across this delay, they should say, this is that blue and orange thing again. And eventually, they should get bored of looking to the blue and orange thing and look to the other side. If they look to the other side, and if they can remember the 2 colors, they should detect the novel color when this display pops up, and they should detect the novel color again when this display pops up. So we know that infants have a bias to look toward interesting novel things. And so what we should see over the course of the 10-second trial here is that infants should look to the no changing side, kind of get bored of that side, look to the changing side, and find it fascinating because there's a bunch of novelty there. My cat wants to come say hello. Okay, so over the course of the 10 seconds, infants should show a preference to look at the changing side if they have a working memory capacity of 2 items. Now, if they don't have a working memory capacity of 2 items, then basically what we should see is equal looking to both sides. So let's say I had a capacity of 1 item, and I look to the blue and orange display. Then when the blue and orange come back, if I can only remember 1 item, essentially the other item is novel. So in this case, I should fail to detect that there's always the same thing on the left side because it's not the same to me, right? Because I can't remember both of those items. So in those cases, I should see 50-50 looking to both sides. Okay, here's an example of a child actually in this task so you get a sense of what I mean. So what you're going to see up on the screen in the top left here of the display is what the child's looking at. And the left side of this display is the left from the child's perspective. I'm going to go ahead and play this. And what you're going to see is that if you watch the child's eyes in the bottom right, he's going to look back and forth to both displays. But if you notice, he's going to tend to look longer to the left side. Okay, I'm going to play that for you again. And what you'll see is that the left side is actually the changing side. So he looks back and forth a little bit, kind of visually exploring the displays, but eventually settles in on that left side, which is the changing side, showing a robust change preference, which is what we're looking for to indicate that he has a good working memory for 2 items. Okay, so now that I've told you a little bit about what the working memory system is and a little bit about how we measure it, for the remainder of the talk, what I'm going to ask is visual working memory a good target for early assessment and intervention? The data I'm going to tell you about is from 2 longitudinal studies, one conducted here in the UK, which we call the BRAIN study, and the other one conducted in Shivgar, India, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. So in December of 2016, we launched an intensive study of working memory and early brain development. We followed 2 cohorts of kids. One group of children was enrolled when they were 6 months of age. The other group was enrolled when they were 30 months of age. And we studied each child at 3 points in time. So for the 6-month-olds, we studied them at 6 months, 18 months, and 30 months of age. And for the 30-month cohort, we studied them at 30, 42, and 54 months of age. Each year, we collected data in the home as infants were, for example, playing with mom in the home environment. We brought the kids into the UEA brain imaging lab for 2 visits, where we measured their functional brain activity as they engaged in that working memory task. And then we also conducted an MRI at Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital to look at how the structure of the brain was changing over the course of the first couple of years of life. In tandem with this project, we collected longitudinal data from children in India in a project called the India Project. So this was conducted in Shivgar, India, shown on the map here. So this is Uttar Pradesh. You may be familiar with where Delhi is or where Lucknow is. Shivgar is a rural community about 90-minute drive from Lucknow. And here's a picture of, we ended up collecting data from a laboratory located in an old palace in the community. So that was the view from the old palace. We enrolled 2 groups of children in India. One group was enrolled at 6 months of age, like in the UK. The other group was enrolled a few months later at 9 months of age. And we studied them from 1 year. So from 6 months to 18 months for that cohort, and from 9 months to 21 months. Importantly, half the children were from a low SES background, socioeconomic status background. The other half were from a high socioeconomic status background. And I should mention, when I say low and high in this context, this is a relative term. So this was a high socioeconomic group from Shivgar, India, which is still, in terms of UK standards, quite a low income group. But we were really interested in the contrast between low and high SES because all families were from the same microcultural context, allowing us to try to isolate the effects of SES in particular. In total, we had 240 families enrolled in the India project. Before continuing, I just want to extend a really warm thank you to the approximately 400 families who joined us on these intensive longitudinal studies. You know, I think in both communities, there's a real commitment to a scientific understanding of early development and a real willingness to engage in science. And I would say in the context of the Norwich Science Festival, this is a fantastic example of how communities can give to scientific endeavors and whoops, what did I do? There we go. So how communities give to science and science can give back to communities. So we want to thank all the families involved in these studies for their major investment of time and energy. Okay, I'm gonna go through a couple of key findings from these projects. I'll foreshadow them and relate them to our assessment and intervention goals. So the first key finding I'll tell you about is that visual working memory is similar across cultures in infancy, but we did detect some delay in infants in India. Second result was that visual working memory in infancy predicts visual working memory 1 year later. So there's some nice individual difference stability across 1 year in these studies. Next, visual working memory is a building block for later word learning and executive function abilities. And finally, I'll show you data that visual working memory is sensitive to contextual factors, focusing in on air quality and nutrition. Okay, so here's our kind of first key result from our projects. What you're looking at is, if you remember the working memory task I showed you, what we're looking for is looking to that changing side as the memory load increases. And what you can see is that if I focus in on the left panel first, these are data from our UK kids. And as we vary the memory load from a low load, which is 1 item, to a medium load, which is 2 items, to a high load, which is 3 items on each display, you can see that infants look longer to that changing side for the easy conditions. Okay, this confirms to us that UK infants can remember at least 1 item, but as the task gets harder, basically they have a harder and harder time detecting which side is the changing side. Shown in the center panel are data from the 6-month-old India cohort and the 9-month-old India cohort. What you can see is very similar results. So all infants do better at the low load than they do at the medium and high loads. But you can see that the 9-month-old India infants look very similar to the 6-month-old UK India, or six-month-old UK kids, whereas the 6-month-olds in India tend to have lower scores overall. So this suggests to us that we might be picking up on essentially a little bit of a delay in the development of visual working memory in India. While we are picking up on a delay, let me just emphasize this was a very exciting finding for us because the developmental context is very different in India, and keep in mind we're bringing kids into a laboratory environment and showing them a display on a television. For many infants in the cohort, this was the first video display they've seen, and so we were very encouraged by these results that we're seeing very systematic, consistent systematic effects across both cultures, even though this is admittedly a pretty strange task for infants in India. Okay, the second key result is that visual working memory is predictive. So what I'm showing you here is, again, that same measure, proportion looking to the changing side, but along the x-axis here in this display is the year 1 score for each infant in the hardest condition, which is that high load condition. Shown along the y-axis is the same measure, proportion looking to the changing side, but now for each infant measured in year 2 at the high load. And what you can see is a nice positive linear relationship between the two. So what that means is that infants who scored relatively high in year 1, so they were able to detect the changing side in year 1, scored relatively high in year 2 as well. Whereas infants who scored relatively low in year 1 in detecting the change scored relatively low in year 2. So what we're seeing here is consistency in individual differences in working memory. And that's very important from an assessment perspective. That means we can measure visual working memory early in development, as early as 6 months of age, and have some confidence in where that child is going. And that's important to have that assessment tool. So that way, if we develop interventions, we can say with confidence, look, we measured visual working memory at 6 months, and now we've moved the trajectory for that child, hopefully boosting their working memory abilities. Third key result is shown here. So visual working memory is a building block for later cognitive abilities. What you're looking at here on the y-axis is the same measure I've been showing you, proportion looking to the changing side and the hardest condition. And now what I'm showing you on the x-axis is results from a language measure. The language measure measures speed of word processing. So what we're going to do in this language task is we're going to show infants 2 pictures of very familiar items like a ball and a flower. And we're going to label one of those items like ball. Obviously, for the India group, we've translated this into the language spoken in Shivkar, which is Awadhi. So we're going to say ball, and we're going to measure how quickly the infants look to the ball correctly. Okay. So in this task, if you have better language abilities, right, you're going to look to the ball more quickly. So fast or low speed of low values on this x-axis mean good performance. And what you can see is kids who look to the ball quite quickly in our sample have higher visual working memory scores, suggesting that visual working memory is a building block for early language abilities. Similarly, we can look at infants, what's called executive function. When we measured this out at 36 months of age or 3 years of age. What I'm showing you on the y-axis again is proportion looking to the changing side. So higher values are good working memory. And along the x-axis is an executive function score, essentially. This measures children's ability to switch rules, switch from, let's say, sorting cards by shape to sorting cards by color, which is a challenging thing for a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old to do. And what you can see is that kids who are better at shifting rules at 3 years of age had higher working memory abilities in infancy. Okay, and this was particularly the case for the low SES sample. We found this relationship. So low SES infants with higher visual working memory scores in infancy had better executive function abilities at 3 years of age. Again, that's really exciting from an assessment perspective. We can measure visual working memory at 6 months of age. We know we can predict visual working memory a year later, and we know that that is related to the language abilities at 18 to 21 months, and we know that it's related to executive function abilities, at least in low SES kids out to 3 years of age. Okay, the last set of findings I wanted to show you demonstrates that not only can we kind of chart this trajectory of visual working memory and other associated cognitive abilities, but visual working memory is sensitive to contextual differences that the infant is experiencing. I focused on 2 contextual effects. One is the impact of poor air quality, and the second is the impact of nutrition on early development. So in our study in India, not only did we measure how visual working memory changes over time, but we tracked concurrent air quality as well. So what we did is in between, sorry, it's very sunny in Norwich today. So you're seeing, there we go, a little bit better. So in addition to tracking visual working memory, in between laboratory visits, we also measured air quality in the home. We used a little device placed in the home in the room that the child spent the most time or the room that the child slept in. And we did this because there's a lot of recent data suggesting that poor air quality may have a negative impact on early development. But interestingly, very few studies have looked at this in infancy, and no studies have looked at whether air quality has a very specific effect on particular cognitive systems like visual working memory. What you can see in the graph on the right is some of the air quality data. The air quality index is shown on the y-axis here. High numbers are bad. And just for some context, this is a US air quality index, and values under 100 are good air quality. And typically in Western samples, you never get values above 100. And what you can see in the homes in India, the air quality is quite poor. Using this scale, 300 is considered hazardous air quality. So in general, the air quality was quite poor in these homes. What I'm plotting on the x-axis is time during the day. And you can clearly see there are these 2 peaks when air quality gets really bad. Those are meal preparation times each day. And so while families are preparing meals in the home air quality is degrading. And the reason is the meal preparation is emitting lots of harmful pollutants into the air. The other thing to note on the figure is I'm plotting different types of cooking fuel. And the red is use of cow dung to cook, so solid materials for cooking. The green is liquid petroleum gas, and the blue is using wood. And what you can see is basically using solid cooking materials like cow dung and wood leads to the poorest air quality in the home. Now, our key question was whether poor air quality is related to cognition in infancy. And I'm showing you two results in this next slide that suggests that yes, poor air quality is associated with poor cognitive abilities. Again, on the x-axis here, we've got the air quality index. Higher numbers are poor air quality. Along the y-axis here is, again, that same measure from the visual working memory task. So proportion looking to the changing side. And what you can see is in year one, children who have higher working memory scores, right? So higher looking to the changing side are in homes with better air quality, whereas children who have poor ability to detect the changing side are being raised in homes with poor air quality. This is just another measure from the same task. This measure is called shift rate. This is the ability to kind of visually scan back and forth. And in many studies, this shift rate has been linked to sort of faster visual processing abilities. So kids who shift back and forth more quickly are thought to have better visual information processing. And again, you can see that kids who shift back and forth are being raised in homes with better air quality, whereas kids who kind of dwell on each display for longer and have a lower shift rate, they tend to have poor air quality in the home. Okay. This is, I'm showing you, this is a final result from the study, again, showing that visual working memory is sensitive to contextual factors. Here we are focusing in on nutrition. So as you may know, growth faltering or stunting is a major problem worldwide. Tends to be associated with poor cognitive outcomes and is related to undernutrition in the first couple of years of life. What we looked at in our sample was whether kids who are experiencing undernutrition showed essentially problems in the first year of life with working memory. Now, one of the interesting things we did in this study is we not only measured the behavioral data, so performance in that working memory task I showed you, but we're measuring how the brain is operating as infants are engaged in that particular task. What I'm showing you here is just one result that links undernutrition to a difference in how the brain is processing visual information in this task. I'm going to zoom in on two parts of the brain here. This little green cluster in the left parietal cortex, and this little yellow cluster in the right temporal cortex. And the little green cluster here in previous studies with children and adults has been linked to working memory abilities. And what you see in normal height kids is a nice brain response. So if you focus in on the plot over here that I'm highlighting with my cursor, the red is what's called a hemodynamic brain response. This is the oxygenated blood in the brain, and the blue is deoxygenated blood in the brain. And basically, when the brain is active and engaged in the task, you see the red curve going up and the blue curve going down. That's kind of a typical brain response when that part of the brain is engaged in the task. And so for normal height kids, you can see that this canonical working memory area in the brain is engaged quite robustly. If we look at the kids who are showing undernutrition, you can see the opposite pattern. So you see the red curve going down. That suggests that this part of the brain engaged in working memory is actually being suppressed or inhibited. If I look down at the lower plot and we focus in on this yellow cluster in the right brain, we see the opposite pattern. So this part of the brain is, instead of being involved in working memory, this is involved in shifting attention to different locations in the world. And what we can see is that the stunted kids show a big brain response in that part of the brain, whereas the normal height kids show a suppression. What we think this reflects is that essentially stunted or undernourished kids are essentially showing a distractibility pattern in the brain and poor working memory. So they're shifting attention back and forth among the displays, whereas the normal height kids or the nourished children are showing this brain response that's typical for engaging their working memory in the task. So our sort of take home from these data is that stunted kids are showing distractibility, while normal height kids are showing good working memory. And this is quite interesting data because this is the first time anyone's shown an impact on functional brain activity in the first year of life in response to undernourishment. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up my talk here with a couple take-home conclusions. What I tried to show you is that visual working memory is a really good target for early assessment and intervention because it can be measured in infancy across cultures. It can be measured early and is predictive of later outcomes. It's a building block for later abilities such as word learning and executive function. And it's affected or sensitive to modifiable contextual factors, including air quality and nutrition. So I think visual working memory is a really good target for early assessments. But I'll be honest with you and say that the way we assess visual working memory in the laboratory is not readily done on a large scale. So we used a really expensive eye tracker in the lab to acquire these data. We used an expensive brain imaging system to acquire these data. And it would be very hard to assess kids on a large scale if you want to do large scale assessment and intervention work. So one of the next steps we're working on in my lab is to try to assess visual working memory more cheaply on a large scale. And we're developing a system right now that would allow for basically in-home testing of visual working memory using a tool called machine learning that will detect which way the infant is looking at the screen for us. And so what we're trying to develop is a way where we could send essentially an assessment tool home for families. They could test their infants in the home. There's a nice advantage there because if the infant is fussy on one day, we could try again the next day. And we could continue to try until we get really a nice, robust assessment from every individual infant in the home. The task itself is very quick, so it takes about 5 to 10 minutes. So we think we'd be able to basically roll out in-home assessment to many, many infants, both here in the UK and in India. That's the assessment side. The other side is to do large-scale intervention. And on that side, we're exploring 3 ideas. One is improving air quality in homes to try to have a positive impact on working memory in the first year of life. A second is improving nutrition and monitoring the transition from breastfeeding to solids, which some of our data suggests is kind of a key transition in the development of early cognitive systems. And then the last target is we're working on an e-intervention with carers in the home because evidence shows that warm, nurturing caregiving that supports infants' visual exploration can actually boost visual working memory in the first year of life. So our longer term goal is to develop effective interventions for at-risk children, and we can celebrate the fact that families in Norfolk are making this possible. With that, I'd like to thank the many children and families who participated both in our longitudinal study in the UK, shown in the black and white photos there at the top, as well as the many families who joined us in this adventure from Shivkar, India. And I also want to thank our collaborators, and especially the collaborators at the Community Empowerment Lab in Lucknow, India. And I believe we now have about 10 or 12 minutes for questions.
Hello there. Sorry, we haven't had any questions posted in the chat just yet, but is there anything else that we could sort of communicate about your findings today, and just, you know, how they can be applied?
Yeah, so, you know, I think the key thing is, like I said, trying to do assessments in an effective way that's easy for every infant. And I think that's really one of the exciting next steps we're working on. You know, if you could assess potentially every infant for their visual working memory abilities early on, our data suggests that would give you a sense of the trajectory that child's on. And then we could effectively try out interventions as we go to see which things might improve working memory before poverty can essentially have its impact. So that's really the vision we're working toward. Let's see, I have the chat window open. So, you know, I think it's in the data I've showed are an important first step. We've got, of course, ways to go to really understand both how working memory develops and also how it feeds into later language and executive function abilities. But I think these data suggest we're at a very promising first step. Could say maybe a little bit more about the link to language and executive function, because that might be of interest to, for example, educators who might be listening. So, you know, one of the important things that infants need to do as they learn words, you know, if you're going to learn which word goes with which object, evidence suggests one of the first things you need to do is understand the visual objects that are around you. So infants who have a better ability to kind of encode the features of an object and where an object might be in their surroundings. So like really knowing which ball is theirs or which sippy cup is theirs. Infants, once they have a very good representation of those objects, it makes it easier to then attach a word to the object, to know that, you know, this round thing that I'm seeing is ball, right? And this funny shaped cup that I drink out of is the sippy cup. So we think that forming a good representation of what the objects are is a first step toward learning what words go with those objects. So that's why we think that visual working memory is an important precursor to word learning abilities. So a question was posted, could you explain what an intervention would involve? Yeah, so, you know, one of the interventions we're interested in pursuing has to do with air quality. And if you know, our data suggests if we could improve air quality, that might improve working memory abilities. And so one of the challenges there is our data suggests that the cooking fuel type matters. So we're considering interventions to offer families access to natural gas to cook instead of wood, for example. And also, importantly, we need the family to actually use the natural gas. So one of the challenges in a couple of related studies looking at air quality have shown that you can offer families like liquid petroleum or LPG gas cooking stoves, but they may have traditional ways of cooking and they prefer the taste of food cooked in the traditional way. So you not only have to have access to cleaner cooking technologies, but we need a sort of cultural transformation as well to adopt those new technologies and understand that emissions from cooking could be a real detriment to how infants' cognitive abilities develop. So we're working to both offer better, lower emissions cooking technologies and also understand in the community ways in which we can improve uptake of those technologies. I can give you a second example on the intervention front. So I mentioned that we are pursuing an e-intervention idea. So this is a intervention approach developed by my colleague Susan Landry in Texas. And what she's found is that you can boost visual cognitive abilities of infants by kind of warm, nurturing caregiving that follows the infants into what they're focusing their attention on. So let's say I'm playing with my infant, and as a parent, I notice that the infant's attention is drawn to a ball, right? So if I then look at the ball and maybe pick up the ball and shake it, and if I talk about the ball, and say, "Oh, Johnny, look, this is your ball. Look, the ball is red. Look, it rolls." Anything I can do to keep the infant focused on the ball helps sustain their attention, and it also helps them develop a stronger, more robust working memory. And we call this, following the infant into their focus of attention. And so the e-intervention we're pursuing with Professor Landry essentially is an online curriculum that helps parents or carers develop this skill of following their infant into their focus of attention, and also helps them sort of reflect on what does it mean to have warm, nurturing caregiving in the context of all the challenges in infancy. Does your research get passed on to practitioners in the early years, such as health visitors, et cetera? It's a great question. We're starting to open up dialogue with the local community on sort of these types of issues in early infancy. We would be very happy to partner with, practitioners in early years to try to see what we could do together. We're very focused in the first couple of years of life, but acknowledging, that there are many different routes you have to go to reach families, right, who might be at risk. And so partnering with many people in the community would be fantastic. So if Rosie, you have ideas on how to do that, I'd love to hear them.
I think that was the last of our questions there, Professor. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you for your presentation today. And thanks to everybody for watching. We do hope you've enjoyed it and found it informative. And please do check out the Science Festival programme at norwichsciencefestival.co.uk to see all the remaining activities across the remainder of the weekend. So thanks again, Professor Spencer, and we look forward to seeing you all across the festival. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening.